What if the most forbidden love story in history didn't happen in secret, but at the heart of an empire? Behind the towering minarets, fragrant gardens, and shimmering domes of the Ottoman Empire, there was a world few dared to acknowledge. A world that pulsed quietly behind velvet curtains, not with war or politics, but with desire. Here, young boys weren't merely trained in court etiquette or classical poetry. They were selected for their beauty, their grace, and their potential to please. This was the empire's hidden truth. Male concubines were real, and they were revered. While Western narratives often portray the Ottoman harem as a secluded realm of veiled women and lustful sultans, that's only half the story. The other half, it belonged to the boys. Known as Yamuks, these young men were brought into the imperial palace, some as early as 8 or 9 years old, taken from conquered lands and noble bloodlines alike. Once inside, they weren't just servants. They were adorned, protected, and at times loved. They represented something far more than pleasure. They were symbols of status, sophistication, and masculine prestige. In elite Ottoman society, having a male companion was not scandalous. It was fashionable. European envoys recorded their awe upon seeing hundreds of boys housed within the palace walls, educated in music, philosophy, language, and the subtle art of companionship. These weren't prisoners. These were investments. And in a world that didn't define sexuality by gender but by power and dominance, their presence wasn't controversial. It was expected. But let's not mistake privilege for safety. To be admired was not the same as being free. Behind every silk robe was a cage. Behind every tender glance, 1,000 unspoken rules. These boys lived in a liminal space, celebrated, yet contained, elevated, yet controlled. They were allowed to flourish only under the eyes of the powerful, and only for as long as their beauty endured, because in the end, this hidden world was not built on love, it was built on utility. And what is cherished in one season can be discarded in the next. And that's just the beginning. To the outside world, it might seem unthinkable that in the heart of an Islamic empire, one of the most powerful the world has ever seen, young boys were not hidden away in shame, but proudly displayed, not as secrets, but as symbols. In the imperial court of the Ottomans, a male concubine wasn't a scandal. He was a status symbol. Like a prized stallion or a rare manuscript, he was evidence of taste, refinement, and dominance. The more beautiful the boy, the more cultured the man who possessed him. This wasn't the love story you were expecting. Because love here wore the mask of power. These boys called Yamuks were not locked in basements or cast into shadows. They were trained, polished, displayed in ceremonies, dressed in silk, taught to entertain, to recite poetry, to serve tea with perfect grace, to play instruments, to listen, to flatter, and if needed, to obey. Foreign envoys, stunned by what they witnessed, wrote of hundreds of these youths living inside the palace, groomed and cherished. Venetian diplomat Benedetto Ramberti described them not as prisoners, but as the delight of the palace. It wasn't a rumor, it was institutional. The Ottoman elite didn't define sexuality the way we do today. There was no binary, no labels like gay or straight. There was only power. The active partner, the one in control, remained a man. The passive partner, the one who submitted, was the one who bore the risk. And so long as the hierarchy was preserved, no one questioned the intimacy. To modern eyes, it's a contradiction. But to the Ottomans, it was normal. A man could have a wife, a harem, and a beloved boy, and all were part of the same system of wealth, control, and prestige. And for the boys, for some, it was salvation and escape from poverty. For others, it was a golden cage they could never leave. Their beauty bought them privilege, but it also put a timer on their worth. Because in a world where admiration and ownership blurred, love was never just love. It was always a transaction dressed as affection. In the Ottoman palace, affection was easy to find, but safety. That was something no one could promise. A glance from a high-ranking official could change a boy's life overnight, elevating him from obscurity to opulence. His beauty could earn him silk robes, gold jewelry, even political leverage. He might dine beside poets, sleep beneath painted ceilings, and feel, if only for a moment, like he mattered. But in a world ruled by power, even love had a price tag. To be desired was to be vulnerable. Because what looked like privilege was often possession. These boys weren't just admired, they were owned. And with ownership came control where they lived, when they spoke, who they touched. Every moment of intimacy was tangled with expectation. To disappoint the wrong man could mean exile, or worse, silence. They lived at the mercy of those who adored them. Behind every whispered compliment was a warning. Behind every gift, a leash. Some boys were lavished with affection until their youth faded and then discarded like worn garments. Others were manipulated into loyalty, coerced into submission with the illusion of care. For a lucky few, their patron might secure them education or future office. But for many, once their beauty waned, so did their worth. And yet in that dark entanglement of desire and control, real emotion still bloomed. Because humans, even inside systems of power, still long to be seen. There were moments when a glance lingered too long, when laughter wasn't rehearsed, when a hand on the shoulder felt less like ownership and more like connection. It wasn't just survival, it was tenderness trying to breathe beneath chains. But those moments were fragile and fleeting. Because the court was a stage, and love between men, while tolerated under rules of dominance, became dangerous the moment it looked mutual. Affection was allowed, attachment was not. Passion that slipped beyond the expected could spark rumors, resentment, and punishment. So, while some boys were touched like they were sacred, they knew the truth. In the palace, to be wanted was never the same as being safe, and love, if it existed, was a candle flickering in a storm. Among the hundreds of nameless boys brought into the courts, 2 names refused to fade: Tahir and Tib. They weren't legends, they were lovers, and their story was never meant to survive. Tahir and Tib were young Ottoman boys captured during a conflict and delivered into the hands of Christian noblemen. What most expected was cruelty, beatings, chains, humiliation. What followed was far stranger. Their captors didn't destroy them, they fell in love with them. The boys were treated not as prisoners, but as companions, gifted robes, books, and whispered affection in candlelit quarters. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like love had defeated war. That tenderness could grow even between enemies, but the world wasn't ready for them. Their relationship, pure or not, was seen as perverse by both sides. In a society that measured morality through the lens of appearance and control, love between equals was the greatest offense. Tahir and Tib were arrested, their lovers were thrown into prison, and what could have been a footnote in shame became something else entirely. Devotion. Unable to bear the separation, the Christian noblemen escaped their cells, converted to Islam, and reunited with the boys, risking everything for the chance to stay together. It wasn't a political act, it wasn't strategy, it was desperation born from love. But even that wasn't enough to turn the tide of history, because empires don't make space for stories like this, and when they do, it's only to erase them. Still, their names remain carved into whispers, a quiet rebellion against a world that punished love for daring to exist. To understand how this hidden world existed so openly, you have to forget everything you think you know about sexuality. In the modern West, desire is labeled. Identities are named, policed, and categorized gay, straight, bi, queer. But in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, there were no such terms. There were no closets, no flags, no binaries. What mattered wasn't who you loved, it was how you loved. The Ottomans didn't view same-sex attraction as deviance. They viewed it through the lens of hierarchy. As long as a man remained in the dominant active role, the possessor not the possessed, his masculinity stayed intact. Love between men wasn't condemned, it was structured, managed, even expected. A high-ranking official could have a wife, a harem, and a beloved boy without contradiction. No one questioned it, no one needed to. The system had room for all of it because it wasn't about romance, it was about power. This fluidity wasn't hidden. It was painted into palace walls, written into poetry, and sung across tiled courtyards. Ottoman literature is filled with verses praising the beauty of boys' lines that would make modern censors tremble, yet were celebrated at the time as works of high art. It wasn't taboo, it was sophistication. Even among the Janissaries, elite soldiers trained from childhood to protect the empire, relationships between men flourished. These weren't secret flings, they were acknowledged pairings, emotionally intense and politically useful. Love could serve power, and so it did. But even in this structure, real love was fragile. When affection crossed the line from performance to authenticity, when a boy and his patron saw each other not as roles but as human, the risks grew sharper. Because power tolerates pleasure, but it fears intimacy. And the moment love stopped being ornamental, it became dangerous. This was the paradox of Ottoman sexuality, fluid in expression, rigid in control. You could desire. You could even touch. But if you began to feel, if you truly loved, then no title, no poetry, no palace wall could protect you. This wasn't some underground affair. It wasn't whispered between shadows or hidden behind locked doors. The Ottoman Empire didn't merely allow the practice of keeping young male companions, it institutionalized it. Inside the palace walls of Topkapi, everything was part of a system, including desire. Boys were selected carefully, some captured in war, others surrendered by families who believed it was an honor to serve the Sultan. They were chosen for their looks, their potential, their ability to charm and obey. Some were as young as 8. Once inside, they were trained not just in etiquette, but in poetry, music, languages, politics, and the art of seduction. They lived in gender-specific quarters, closely monitored by guards and court officials. This wasn't love. It was grooming elevated into protocol. Reports from Venetian envoys such as Benedetto Ramberti describe hundreds of these boys living within the palace, described chillingly as the delight of the Lord. They could not leave. They had no say in their future. Their beauty was their currency, and every day the clock ticked louder. Some Yamuks rose to power. The lucky few were eventually granted official positions, titles, even wealth. Others were simply replaced. When their youth faded, so did their worth. But the machinery never stopped. This wasn't just the Sultan's indulgence, it was a political structure. These boys could be manipulated into loyalty. Their presence kept rivals distracted, their obedience fed the hierarchy. And their silence, that was the most valued currency of all. Even the most powerful man in the empire, the Sultan himself, had the final say over their lives, their roles, their futures, even their lovers. To the outside world, it looked like privilege. But inside, it was a gilded cage, a life scripted in advance where performance passed for affection and compliance was mistaken for choice. Because in the Ottoman court, even love was subject to imperial order. And behind every soft gaze or silken robe stood something colder, a system that knew exactly what beauty was worth and exactly when it expired. What was once art became scandal. What had been celebrated became criminal. And the empire that once embraced complexity began to collapse under the weight of foreign morality. For centuries, the Ottoman world had its own rhythm, its own logic. Love between men wasn't hidden. It was structured, poetic, even institutional. But as the empire opened its gates to Western diplomacy, trade, and civilized values, the air began to change, and with it, the lens through which desire was viewed. Europe didn't just bring guns, railways, and treaties, it brought shame. With the rise of Victorian moral codes and Christian ideals of sexuality, Ottoman intellectuals and lawmakers began internalizing foreign judgments. What once passed as courtly affection was now called deviance. A relationship once seen as cultured was reframed as sin. The most devastating blow came in 1858 with the implementation of a new penal code modeled after the French legal system. Suddenly, acts against modesty weren't just frowned upon, they were punishable. By law. Men could be imprisoned, fined, and publicly humiliated for behaviors that had just decades earlier been part of palace life. In Istanbul, enforcement was brutal. Men were dragged from cafes and bathhouses, their heads shaved in disgrace. Some were beaten, others were sexually assaulted in custody. Fear took the place of poetry. Silence replaced celebration. It wasn't just the law that changed, it was culture. Writers stopped composing love poems to boys. Artists stopped painting them. The janissaries, once known for their bonds and emotional intimacy, were disbanded. Even the word Yamuk faded from the public lexicon. A society that had once embraced fluidity was now rewriting itself to conform to Western definitions of decency. Not because it had to, but because it was told it should. This wasn't evolution, it was erasure. A slow, quiet suffocation of a world that didn't fit neatly into someone else's rules. Because when an empire starts apologizing for its past, it begins forgetting it altogether. Most love stories end with separation. But the story of Tahir and Tib refused to fade quietly. Imprisoned for a love neither Christian nor Muslim society could accept, the two Ottoman boys, once adored, once cherished, were now cast as criminals. Their Christian lovers, noblemen, who had once held power and land, now sat behind iron bars, punished not for violence or treason, but for tenderness. The world had turned against them. But love, real love, doesn't kneel to rules. It breaks them. In a daring act that would echo through whispers of history, the Christian captors escaped prison. They didn't run away into hiding. They ran toward Tahir and Tib, toward danger, toward the only future they still believed in. And then they did the unthinkable. They converted to Islam, not to manipulate, not to appease, but to be allowed to live at last in the same skin as the men they loved. They shed their names, their faith, their social standing, all for a hope no government or empire could guarantee. It was a gamble, a final, desperate rebellion against a world that saw them as wrong. And still it wasn't enough, because no empire, Ottoman or Christian, had room for a love that crossed this many lines: political lines, religious lines, gendered expectations, social class. Their union was a threat not because it was lustful, but because it was genuine. They weren't playing roles. They weren't serving masters. They were choosing each other. That's what made it dangerous. That's what made it unforgettable. And though history doesn't record what happened to them after their voices fade from the records, their names reduced to rumor, their choice remains. A final act of devotion, a love not shaped by empire, but in defiance of it. In a time when love was controlled, criminalized, and caged, Tahir and Tib didn't run. They believed, and then they leapt. As the empire changed, so did its desires. By the late 19th century, the golden era of the male beloved had begun to wither, not in a violent collapse, but in a slow, almost invisible retreat. The boys were vanishing. Their laughter no longer echoed in palace halls. Their names no longer appeared in poetry. Their silken robes were folded away, replaced by jeweled gowns and veils. The royal gaze had shifted from boys to women. Western influence didn't just bring morality, it brought new fantasies. The Sultan's favor now turned toward female concubines, and with it, a new architecture of courtly beauty emerged. The harem, once shared in emotional duality, became a strictly gendered space. Male beloveds were no longer a symbol of sophistication. They became a whisper of the past, a cultural embarrassment, a scandal best forgotten. Writers who once praised the rosy cheeks of their boy companions began to write of feminine elegance. Poets abandoned their odes to male eyes and shifted to queens and maidens. Desire had been repainted, redefined, reassigned. Even the military, once known for its deep emotional pairings between janissaries, was restructured. Intimacy between men, once ritualized and even romanticized, was now discouraged, hidden, feared. And while the public celebrated the elegance of the imperial harem, something older, deeper, and more tender had been buried beneath it. Ottoman scholar Ahmed Cevdet Pasha mourned the change in quiet frustration. Woman lovers have increased in number, while boy beloveds have disappeared. It is as if the people of Lot have been swallowed by the earth. He wasn't praising immorality. He was grieving a lost paradigm, a world where love was fluid, complex, and unconcerned with binaries, where men could hold hands in public without shame, where devotion wasn't always heterosexual, but it was always human. And just like that, centuries of hidden beauty, dangerous tenderness, and emotional rebellion were erased not by fire or war, but by fashion, fear, and forgetting. Not with a scream, but with silence. Empires fall, laws change, cultures forget, but love, real love, never disappears. It adapts, it hides, it survives. Long after the male concubines vanished from palace records, long after the poets turned their pens to safer subjects, long after the whispers were silenced by fear, the memory remained, not in the textbooks, not in the official chronicles, but in the shadows, in the margins, in the silence between what was recorded and what was erased. The world tried to bury their stories, but history has a heartbeat. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them footsteps echoing in empty marble halls, laughter that once danced in candlelight, the sound of two names whispered into the dark Tahir and Tib. Because love like theirs doesn't belong to one empire, one faith, one body. It belongs to anyone who has ever been told their love was a crime. To anyone who has ever dared to reach across borders, across genders, across fear, and said, "I choose you anyway." This isn't just about the Ottomans. It's about what we erase when we get scared. It's about the soft things we bury under hard systems. It's about the quiet rebellions we never see coming. Tahir and Tib may not have toppled an empire. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't lead armies. But they did something far more dangerous. They loved, and they refused to stop. In a time where love was weaponized, categorized, and condemned, they stood still. And that kind of stillness, that kind of quiet, ordinary defiance, it outlasts walls. It outlives shame. It survives even when no one's watching. So maybe they didn't escape history, but maybe, just maybe, they became part of something deeper. A reminder that even in a palace built on power and a prison built on fear, love still found a way to breathe. If this story moved you, challenged what you thought you knew, or opened your eyes to a forgotten corner of history, don't let it fade. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful untold stories from the past. Every view, every click, every comment helps us uncover what history tried to silence. Join us as we give voice to the lost, light to the hidden, and meaning to the moments the world tried to forget. This is more than content. It's memory reclaimed.